Hello, friends. In today's episode, we talk about various forms of abuse. This could raise distressing and traumatic thoughts or memories, so proceed with care. And if you or someone you know has been hurt, or if you are thinking about hurting someone, there is help. Tell someone. Seek a mental health professional. And if you don't have anyone to talk to, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For more information, visit faith.yale.edu.
Religion is like nuclear fission. When done well, nuclear fission can give us free electricity indefinitely. With a little bit of care and a little bit of grooming, it's this tremendously powerful source of energy and flourishing. But it also, when done poorly, can melt a reactor, kill tens of thousands of people, and irradiate land for 1,000,000 years. What we do when we spiritually abuse someone, not only do we harm them, we cut them off from what may have been their primary healing source in the same move. We make it harder for them to use their faith, use their spirituality to heal from the harm we just did to them.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. There's this saying that comes up in sermons and blog posts and media sound bites and, well, podcasts. The church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. It's one of those quotes that becomes so widely circulated, so often spoken, and maybe so very true that you can't actually find the original attribution. In this case, everyone from St. Augustine to John Chrysostom to Pope Francis to your old pastor to even the advice columnist Dear Abby gets credit for it. Thinking of the church as a field hospital is a wonderful thought. But what happens when the very place you go to for healing becomes the locus of trauma? What happens when the hospital becomes a battlefield? This episode, we're going to try to introduce productive ways of thinking about spiritual and religious abuse. For our purposes, we're talking about any form of physical, mental, sexual, or spiritual harm or trauma that occurs in a religious context. But the fact is, there aren't any widely accepted definitions of the term, and sadly, you don't always know it when you see it. In fact, that's how it thrives. That's how it has persisted. As counselor and researcher Dr. Paula Swindle has observed, it breathes in darkness. It twists the sacred. It's perpetrated by wolves disguised as sheep, often appealing to the very spiritual principles of love, community, and connection to God that the abuse undermines. And that's why this is such an important topic for research in journalism. So I asked my friend Dan Koch to join me because he's active on both fronts. His podcast, You Have Permission, is a growing resource for people asking very difficult questions about Christianity. He hosts a space for a holistic and healing discussion among people with a variety of differences, political, theological, moral, as well as those who have been hurt or pushed away from Christianity. A place for faith deconstruction and reconstruction to happen. But Dan is also currently a doctoral student in counseling psychology at Northwest University and is focusing his work on spiritual and religious abuse. In this conversation, we explore an introduction to the tragic and damaging phenomenon of spiritual abuse, its impact on the emotional, intellectual, and spiritual life, and identify some of the most important factors in understanding its underlying causes and developing approaches to healing for victims. Thanks for listening, and may you be well. Dan, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
I am very pleased to be here, Evan.
Yeah, you're a good friend for doing this, and I'm excited to talk to you about a really sobering topic, one I know that is of interest to you both academically and personally. Yeah. But first, I wanted to just acknowledge that you're the host of a podcast that covers this topic of spiritual and religious abuse, but by far not only this topic. You Have Permission is your podcast, and it's really more than a podcast. It's a community of people who are working through various stages of faith and doubt, deconstruction of their faith, reconstruction of their faith, How would you describe what you're doing in that show and in the community and how you're cultivating it?
Yeah, I mean, what the show does is pretty straightforward. It is some way of combining Christianity with really the most difficult and salient questions of living in the modern world. But to get a little more particular, that is often done primarily with a white evangelical background in mind. That's my own background. That's definitely the lion's share of my listeners' background. And then another wrinkle is that I am pursuing a doctorate in psychology, and psychological questions, topics, angles are brought up more than, say, the hard sciences or something like that. And then there is the community. Yeah, there's like a Facebook group for patrons of the show that's become quite vibrant. And the little offshoot of the show was developing this website with my friend Sari, our mutual friend Sari Concepcion, who introduced us, actually. We developed a site called soyourdeconstructing.com, which is basically a bunch of resources for people who are going through, especially early phases of like faith change and doubting and all that stuff. So I guess it has, you're right, morphed into this more than a podcast. I almost wanted to be a little sarcastic and go, it's so much more than a podcast when you said that. But then I realized, oh, he's actually right. It actually has become quite a bit more than a podcast. I don't think about it that way every day, but it does seem to be true.
It bears mentioning the context in which we met through Sari Martin Concepcion. That was at the Theopsych project then at Fuller, but now at Blueprint 1543. And what's fascinating, I think, about your show is the way that it brings theology and psychology into conversation. And that was the goal of that particular project as well. And that kind of integration is happening, especially in our topic for today, which is spiritual and religious abuse.
Right.
So I asked you to come on because I wanted to frame this really tragic phenomenon that has been around, well, just forever, it seems like. Historically, it's been there. Around 20 years ago is when the Catholic clergy scandals around childhood sexual abuse started to emerge more mainstream. But this thrives in darkness and silence and secrecy.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could start by just talking a little bit about your own personal interest in the topic, what it is, and why you're pursuing it in your own doctoral study.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is just to acknowledge that I'm a student, not an expert.
Right.
And I mean that in two ways. Literally, as I said, I'm in a program. I don't have my doctorate, but I also mean it in that there's not a whole lot to know at an academic level about the topic. There are a handful of peer-reviewed studies, and maybe half of those are dissertations. It's very little. It's a very early topic in academia and in peer-reviewed research, which is really exciting, but also is limiting in terms of what we can say around it with any form of confidence. So my own interest in the topic is autobiographical. I have kind of lifelong panic disorder. I like to say it's in remission. I haven't had a panic attack in quite a while, but it's something that I struggle with biologically. Nature, nurture, both. My mom has it. Yeah. My grandpa probably had it. And so when I was in junior high, I was given a book by some ostensibly well-meaning adult called 96 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in September of 1996. That was the takeaway, whether or not that was the literal title.
Yeah.
And I received it in April of 1996.
Oh, my goodness.
Or thereabouts. So I'm 12, almost 13 at this point, and I am freaking out. I'm having panic attacks every night for a month or two. I wouldn't have known to call them that then, of course. Can't fall asleep. Yeah. A memory I like to share around this because I think it's funny, but also gets at some of what was going on is I remember praying pre-puberty to God at night before I went to bed. God, please just let me be like naked with a woman before you return.
Oh,
I won't do anything. I don't even want to do anything. And I don't know why people do want to do anything. I'm not going to sin. Please let me have that experience. But deeper than that was like wanting to be married, have children, grow older, live out a normal life. And I was petrified that I would not be able to do that because Jesus would come back so quickly. And that I would now call that a form of spiritual abuse. That basically telling a 12-year-old that they're going to basically die in 6 months. That's not the whole story. They're going to be, according to this person, I would probably be raptured and go to heaven. But that was really careless. I can't remember if it was a teacher or a parent or a choir teacher. I don't remember. But like, it was an abuse of that power that had really rough effects on me. And that continued actually for years after having anxiety around that topic for at least a decade for me. And so that is my personal history. And I was originally planning on focusing my own research around like that nexus. So end times and mental health stuff. But as I got into the literature, the very scant literature on spiritual abuse, I realized, I have to just focus on the main topic here because we just don't know that much. That the thing I'm interested in is like a 10 years down the road of a topic. So that led me into a broader sort of reading and beginning to work on my own work there.
So that clarifies the sense in which spiritual and religious abuse covers a variety of species of trauma and abuse and harm.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could like just help lay that contextual land. Trauma and fear and terror around end times is one specified version of the kind of scope of spiritual abuse that can occur. What else is out there, speaking broadly?
Yeah. So I think the best way to think of it is like it's a Venn diagram with other kinds of abuse. So some other kinds of abuse may also be spiritual abuse. Usually this is emotional and psychological abuse. That's the largest category, but also sexual abuse, domestic violence, other, child abuse, other kinds of physical abuse. So in order to be spiritual or religious abuse, and by the way, those terms are used interchangeably, there needs to be some kind of religious element to it. So it might just be a regular abuse by a religious figure, a priest, a pastor, or something like that. Or it could be that the content of the actual abuse is partly or wholly religious. So scripture being used to justify a domestic abuse situation, for instance, would be an example of that.
Yeah.
A couple other examples would be something like a really narcissistic and or controlling pastor. So this person, often a male, but theoretically not always, might explicitly claim to speak on God's behalf. This pastor might imply or explicitly claim that leaving his particular church or denomination, you'd be risking going to hell. They might be way more involved in the day-to-day lives of their parishioners than they ought to be, such that they require approval of like non-religious choices or dissuading people from certain vocational paths or colleges, or they can pressure people to give financially when it's known that they can't really afford it. So that's one category, is the controlling or narcissistic leader. You can also have some of that control enacted by the group itself. You can have shaming and shunning. You can have group pressure to conform to certain norms. Sometimes this would be something like your spiritual or moral performance has to be very high in order for you to be loved and accepted. Right.
So there's that conditionality.
Conditionality, exactly. That goes explicitly against so much of Jesus's teachings,
right?
And yet it can form. Moving a little further from maybe what is like the center of it all, you've got stuff like violence, horror, terror, extreme forms of punishment, developmentally inappropriate things for children. Some other interesting issues are it can result in a lot of personal like maladjustment basically for people. So they can distrust God. They can, of course, lose their faith. They can feel isolated. They can have panic attacks in religious settings. They can end up with an image of God that is contra to the image of God they're raised with, or the image of God that you and I, for instance, believe is accurate, a God of love and acceptance. Right. And then even further out, there's like medical care can be not given for religious reasons. The best example of this is maybe Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusions, which people are probably familiar with. But there's also like interpreting mental or physical problems as spiritual problems. There's arguing against mental health treatment and over spiritualizing.
Which is very, very prominent.
Very common. Yes.
There's a lot of skepticism of therapy.
And I'll just mention one other category that I don't think people would always think of, which is environments that really restrict any kind of raising of questions or concerns, or even expression of negative emotions. There's some interesting sort of findings coming out around those issues, which you might not think would be spiritual abuse, but when you start to look into what that does to someone's faith, you can start to recognize it as a kind of emotional or psychological abuse with a spiritual overlay or religious overlay, that we don't question this stuff. We have a spirit, a culture of conformity that can be propagated by either leadership and or the group itself.
So let's talk a little bit about the prevalence. That's honestly, it's like a horrifying laundry list of potential harm.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And so tell me a little bit about what we currently know about the prevalence of spiritual and religious abuse.
Yeah, so in the West, in the English-speaking West, there is one published survey, and then my own quantitative work is a follow-up survey, which is done, but has not gone through sort of some of the institutional and peer review processes.
Yeah.
Especially as a student, there are more of those, which is good. So I can't really talk about my own results, but I can talk about Dr. Lisa Oakley's results from 2013 in the UK.
All right.
So here are a few numbers from what she found there. She asked questions about one's current church and also in a previous church. So each question has two responses.
Okay.
So at least in a previous church, 70% of people felt unable to raise questions and issues. And 50% of them felt that at least sometimes in their current church.
To clarify, that's not issues about spiritual abuse in particular, but just at all.
No, just broadly speaking, raise questions and issues.
Yeah.
I mentioned raising emotions in terms of feeling able to express unhappiness in a previous church setting, so not the one that they're in now, ostensibly one they like less. Only 40% felt able to express unhappiness at least sometimes in that previous church setting. 50% in a previous church were made to feel shame and blame at least sometimes. 69% in a previous church thought that scripture was used to control behavior at least sometimes. There's 15% of her people currently distrust God as a result of this kind of stuff.
What sounds like what those sort of studies are doing is looking at the vectors that sort of surround the phenomenon of spiritual abuse that might help to clarify where there is a correspondence or correlation, and then provide opportunities for looking deeper into the actual underlying root causes.
Yes, and that's partly what my survey did. So I took her 9 or 10 items and expanded it out based on the qualitative literature to 68 items. And so we'll have, when this stuff gets properly vetted, we'll have a lot more prevalence data on a lot more concrete things, like some of them I mentioned earlier, like being shunned or having panic attacks because of religious settings, or my pastor explicitly claiming to speak on God's behalf, stuff like that. But what I can say with the early look at the data is it looks like prevalence from our two studies is roughly similar on items that were worded the same or quite similarly. And so her numbers are looking fairly stable in terms of in a Western English-speaking church context.
Can you identify a range of percentages for spiritual abuse in the United States?
At this point, it's too poorly defined, right? So, in fact, but this brings up a good angle here, or a nuance.
Yeah.
We're calling it abuse because some of it is clearly abusive. Pressuring a wife or husband to stay in a physically abusive marriage is abuse. That's not harm. But as you go down, there are things that might be better termed religious or spiritual harm. Okay. There is very early research rumblings around trying to define adverse religious experiences. So these may not quite reach the level of abuse, and you could have many of these and still be happily a Christian. I'm a practicing Christian today,
Yeah.
despite my own somewhat mild history of spiritual abuse. I took my own survey and I score pretty low, compared to the average person. So I had a pretty good go of it. But I had some very acute symptoms for many years. It did cause me to leave behind that particular understanding of eschatology, and I'm very glad that I did. So this stuff is not always game over, and there's a huge continuum. And so once you recognize that continuum, to give a global percentage is really impossible, even if you had all the data in the world. What you can do is say, this particular thing appears to happen about this often. And so I think that as people get some language for this stuff, most of them will be able to identify examples of this in their life, not necessarily that were lethal to their faith, but maybe that were. You think about clergy sex abuse victims, and some of them are still going to mass, but you certainly don't blame them if they're not, and a lot of them aren't.
You say giving language to it and identifying that there is a spectrum that goes from just something that's irresponsible or lightly damaging into absolutely harmful, and then just black and white abuse.
Yeah, and straight criminal at some points, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where work that happens at an academic psychological level is important for the broader culture as well. When psychologists are so good at popularizing their work, it needs to enter the broader consciousness with that language in hand, so that people in real situations and environments can then have the language and terminology they need for identifying what is in fact abuse and being able to respond. When you talk about the varieties and potential for doing this, especially in circles where it thrives in darkness, it's often the behavior itself it comes across as confusing to the victims and the communities involved because of the way that it's rationalized and justified vis-a-vis the theology and even like the Christian life of the community itself. And I know many people will now be familiar this year and last with known leaders. There's some famous examples that have happened to come out over the past couple of years. I'm thinking of two in particular, and that's Jean Vanier, this beloved activist for the disabled community and philosopher and theologian.
That one hurt a lot for me, man. He's a
same here,
major hero of mine. Yeah,
absolutely. But going up to that, yeah, it is right. And then also recently, as some recent reports came out that were alleged last year when he passed away, but Ravi Zacharias, the famous apologist, you've discussed both of those particular cases on your show.
Yeah, episodes about each.
And those are famous, they're celebrity versions of them. But it's important to point out that the prevalence, there's far more than just the celebrity versions, that they're actively present all over the place. But I wonder if you'd comment on that aspect of it, the component of celebrity, fame, and making the pastor or leader a centerpiece of an organization, and how that can promote this kind of abusive behavior.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my understanding, celebrity and increased power, even if that power, like Jean Vanier, is not material power, he doesn't run, like contrasting Ravi and Jean is interesting, because Vanier did not run a large organization with millions of dollars in slush funds. Vanier's l'Arche is, first of all, he's taken a vow of poverty, so he probably owned nothing of it. And it's not like homes where people with disabilities are treated with Christ-like care is like a great way to make money. I'm sure l'Arche, and of course, I'm sure they're struggling mightily after the revelations about their founder, but probably struggled financially anyway. Whereas Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, it's clear from the reporting that came out about his actions that like he had hundreds of thousands of dollars to throw around on various things at multiple points over the last 10, 15 years. And he was a celebrity in a different way than Vanier was a celebrity. So there is some similarities and some differences. So that's the difference between the two of them. The similarity is that they both had tremendous perceived spiritual power among people who looked up to them. So in the case of Vanier, he has these, oh my gosh, thank God, literally, that he did not abuse any of the people with disabilities in the large communities. Not that abusing anybody is better than anyone else, but it would have been a whole different kind of heartbreak. But Vanier had women under his spiritual care. He was their spiritual director. And he got into some weird stuff. And he had some weird ideas, apparently, from his predecessor about Mary and sexuality. And I don't know him at all. I never met him. The person that I had on my show knew him fairly well and worked at L'Arche. And so she could speak a lot more to what she thought was going on there. But the point just being, Ravi also had that. And in a lot of the accounts of him and these masseuses, there was the beginning of the relationship that turned sexually abusive would start out as like a kind of a pastoral thing where he would ask about their lives, and they knew that he was, this great man of ministry. And so that opens the door to exploitation should the person in that position want to exploit. And both of them clearly did. And you get that to a smaller degree if someone's less famous, but it's not hard to see that you don't have to be a famous pastor or priest to have a similar opening. And if you've seen or read much around the Catholic clergy abuse stuff, especially stuff in Boston, which comes to mind, it's like there was such a culture in Boston in these Catholic neighborhoods of the priests were the basketball superstars. Like they were the men of highest honor in the community. Now, growing up in California and now living in Seattle, that sounds a little alien to me in 2021. But think about growing up in a small town in Alabama and your local Baptist preacher. Who's got the power in that town? And it really depends. It's, of course, person to person, place to place. But that's how I would tie some of those together. I think that was a slightly convoluted. I apologize.
No, that's okay. What it seems like authority is the factor there, is that you don't need notoriety or fame to make it work. What you need is a kind of authority or perceived influence, even in a local setting. And it doesn't matter just how extensive that is at a public level. There are small ponds where the kind of influence and power dynamics are enough to create an abusive scenario.
Oh, yeah. Obviously, abuse can happen anywhere. Parents can abuse their children. All it takes is having a kid. They don't even have to look up to you. They can hate you and you can still abuse them. But yeah, there's a certain kind of agreement between parties for some of this type of abuse where some of it's only possible if I look up to you as a spiritual leader or some other kind of a leader. But that can happen. That happens very quickly in religious settings.
So as we've seen in just American culture, even over the last 4 years, the importance and significance and weight of religious figures, and in particular, Christian figures, on public opinion, on political perspectives, on ethical, moral perspectives. The weight is heavy. And we, of course, we look to religious leaders precisely because they're in that position. So we trust them. So we enter into relationships of apprenticeship or discipleship or mentorship with them. I wonder if you can help explain some of that, the broader context of religious influence and how that kind of is a factor here.
And I think that it can seem especially opaque to people who are not religious. Like, why the hell do these people hold sway? Who's listening to them? But I've been working on an analogy that I like, which is that religion is like nuclear fission. So when done well, nuclear fission can give us free electricity indefinitely with a little bit of care and a little bit of grooming. It's this tremendously powerful source of energy and flourishing, to bring in Miroslav's terminology here. But it also, when done poorly, can melt a reactor, kill tens of thousands of people, and irradiate land for 1 million years and make it radioactive. And this is, I think, backed up by the literature on the power of religion. It's linked to all kinds of really good health outcomes, mental health outcomes, community solidarity, whatever. And then it also, as anybody knows who has gone through religious change or some sort of religious disorientation, can be massively upsetting and can leave you completely unmoored. So the power of religion, I think, is an important aspect of understanding the power that religious leaders have to sometimes abuse. And actually, this is what I think is the most sinister aspect of religious and spiritual abuse, is that if we grant, and again, I think the research is clear here, that religious groups and spirituality are major forms of healing from trauma specifically, and there's tons of research on this, then what we do when we spiritually abuse someone, not only do we harm them, we cut them off from what may have been their primary healing source in the same move. We make it harder for them to use their faith, use their spirituality to heal from the harm we just did to them. And that is a unique aspect to this kind of abuse.
Yeah, because it doesn't just cut them off temporarily. The way that that this kind of abuse can manifest is lifelong.
Yeah, it can very much be lifelong. Yep.
Yeah. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about an aspect of this, which is when a spiritual leader exploits their leadership and the broader popular respect or just recognition of authority of the religious leader. Sometimes that ends up even in a situation where the victim of abuse is encouraged to conflate the leader with God. And you brought up the effect of this kind of abuse on one's image of God. And what do you say about that?
I think it's very hard. My own sense is that it's psychologically difficult for a person in a religious group with a leader that they like, which is most of the time, people can at least somewhat self-select into their religious groups. It's very hard to not associate that person in some way with God, because they are mediating, whether or not they say they are, they're mediating your religious experience.
Yeah.
And you and I both talked about how difficult it was to hear that news about Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier had mediated some pretty significant amount in terms of living people of my own experience of God and experience of Christ.
Yeah, he gave me language that I never had before for understanding the love of God.
Yeah. He redeemed an entire gospel for me with his commentary on John.
Oh my goodness.
And finding in John this tenderness and care of Jesus for actually a lot of people with what we would now call disabilities, which of course was his area. And I don't think I'll ever read that commentary again. And I don't know what I'm going to do with John now. And that's a big question mark now in my life that I haven't looked at since.
That's right. Yeah. And I think for the sake of this conversation, we should bracket even the sort of implications about how you ought to treat the very difficult ethical dilemma around how to regard the ideas or writings or teachings of someone who's done so much harm.
But very prevalent, for instance, for people who found Ravi Zacharias' apologetics work helpful. I feel, it's weird, I feel emotionally fortunate that I was not that into apologetics. But I've had a couple friends reach out to me that were pretty crushed by it, that he was a real big sort of fighter for them, a warrior for them, or I don't know, maybe just gave them language for stuff and was inspiring. And so that's a good example of kind of what I'm talking about, right? Like,
I think so.
His arguments, his style, whatever it was about him, his posture was a big part for some people of how they could be confident being a Christian.
This is a very fascinating aspect of the impact of spiritual abuse for me, which is that it has an impact on the plausibility of faith.
Yes, that's good language.
And the spiritual and emotional experience of Christianity for both the victim and, let's call it, just the audience of the abuse, which could be the local church, it could be the family, but it could also be the readership and the appreciating, just the appreciating fan of that person's work. In the same way that you and I were fans of Jean Vanier, Ravi Zacharias has just millions of fans. And although in the moment we might be able to describe or with our rational brain that the failing of an individual does not undermine the truthfulness of whatever they said.
Technically, right?
In some kind of logical way.
In a logical way.
The rational brain can make that point. But the emotional brain...
More than just the emotional brain. I mean, Jesus says a good tree bears good fruit. You can also make rational arguments, right? That, this is one knock against these arguments, that this person made them in totally bad faith, or appeared to, or either made them in super bad faith in Ravi Zacharias' case, or was so disassociated within himself that he could make these arguments in good faith and then also live this other life, such that how much power do these arguments have, even if you believe them?
That's right. So fair enough that that you can take even a rational perspective, but you could just go ahead and affirm that the truthfulness stands. And yet, and this is my point, and yet you might still be repelled from Christianity. You might be repelled not just from that community, but from God. And that is what makes this just such a dangerous kind of scenario. And it really just brings into question the kinds of communities where this kind of behavior is possible. And the reason I put it that way, the plausibility of faith, is I tend to see a lot of what you're doing in You Have Permission as helping people through the process of thinking about that plausibility, which is to be distinct from the rationality or truthfulness of it. It's about the livability of faith today. And so I want to get you talking a little bit more about the impact of spiritual abuse on the livability of faith.
Yeah, I think maybe livability gets closer in my mind to what you're talking about. Plausibility for me is still a rational, abstract term, might be true, but maybe what you're talking about is more like what Francis Spufford gets at with his idea in his book Unapologetic of it's emotionally viable, it's emotionally plausible. I think he just says it makes emotional sense. Christianity makes emotional sense, I think, is his main argument in that book. Nobody has a purely rational relationship with Christianity, nor even probably any argument for it, because why do they want to hear that argument? Why are they interested in watching that video? Because the object of those arguments, the truth or falsity of Christianity, as it were, has all this emotional weight, right? If someone is a practicing Christian, then that means some proportion of the center of their life is wrapped around this idea. And so it's going to rupture not only the abstract, but it's going to rupture the emotional as well. What we don't know very much about, and actually Paula Swindle and I are going to talk about this on an upcoming episode of her podcast, Sacred Intersections, is what about the fallout for the fans of Ravi? And as far as I've seen, there hasn't been any academic research on this. The research that has been done is with individuals who have been abused in person in some way by a religious group or leader that they were in real life involved in. It was their church or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. Direct involvement.
And so this is like a next level question of what about people who have platforms and they don't know personally all the people that they reach? What if I were to be involved in a scandal? How am I spiritually abusing the listeners of my show, the patrons of the podcast, whatever, the members of the Facebook group? That's really interesting. I don't know most of them personally either, but they know me in a certain kind of a way. And what role do I play as one of their inputs in their not just rational, but emotional faith life? That's like kind of a scary thing to start thinking about, because it reminds me of this gift to be able to do this stuff and to walk with people, but also the responsibility of that and the potential fallout. It sobers you up, I guess, is one way to say it.
Yeah, sobering is right. And I think your point about making emotional sense as well as making rational sense says something about the centrality of faith as a kind of holistic experience for a person, that it engages the rational mind, it engages the will, it engages the emotions or feeling part of us. it ought to, as has been more popular recently, it ought to engage the body in important ways. The fact that spiritual and religious abuse is mostly uncovered, mostly unstudied, happens in the darkness. It turns the hospital into a battlefield, right? The place where you're supposed to go for healing becomes the source of the trauma itself. It cuts you off.
The scalpel into a sword or a dagger.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's right. The plowshare becomes the sword, the other way around. Really is the perfect storm. And it's the perfect storm because it's supposed to be where you find wholeness.
Right.
But when people become disintegrated through abuse in that very place, it's really important to point that out because of just how damaging that is in a person's life, and just how damaging that is to communities of people, and how it destroys and just eviscerates a person at an emotional, psychological level.
Yeah, you're making me get emotional here, Evan, because I'm so interested in the methodical academic study of this stuff. And I haven't myself done one of these qualitative studies yet. My work so far is quantitative. And I can sometimes bypass that. Yeah. And as a student, I don't have clients yet. So I'm in this little grace period before it all starts to hit me more fully and in a more fully human kind of a way. But yeah, there's a lot to mourn there. And it also highlights the importance of having safeguards. And one of the things that we run into is Dr. Lisa Oakley from the UK. She's one of the earliest of the current crop of researchers on this issue. She started publishing stuff on spiritual abuse with her dissertation, which I think was in 2009. And she's now working with some co-researchers around what's the opposite of spiritual abuse? Like, how do we inculcate the opposite kind of community? What are some values and possible guidelines? And her work has focused a lot on institutional safeguards and informing institutional practice. And there's so much here, but an issue you run into is that you're talking about the darkness, and there is unfortunately a correlation between lower church polity and style and fewer safeguards on abusive behavior. Actually, the Catholic Church is a great example. As far as I understand it, they have done an incredible job of cracking down on this stuff in the last decade or so. And if the data is to be trusted, and there are some pretty impartial people working on this, as I understand it, Catholic journalists and stuff like that, like the incidence has gone way, way down. And my impression is the reason they're able to do that is they have almost unlimited top-down institutional power that they can exert, and they can write new rules.
So it's very high polity is what you might say.
High polity. And you don't like it? Screw you. You're going to get banished to some tiny parish. Like, you have to do it. They are literally in charge. And the further you get to an independent Baptist Bible church, the further you get from any of that kind of power. Yeah. And so
because the pastor is the king.
Yeah.
The pastor's the president.
And I recognize the theological reasons for that it fills a certain kind of a niche that, like, God is not an institution. God is wilder than our minds can come up with. So I get that. But one of the natural consequences of that is, so what recourse do people have? If you end up with a community for whatever reason with this culture of conformity, whether the pastor did that on purpose, did it not on purpose, didn't do it. Maybe there happens to be 5 families in the congregation that have a lot of social power that are really into conformity, and the pastor didn't even try. If you end up with such a situation, what's the recourse? How are potential victims being protected? Are there any institutional guidelines here, boundaries, processes? Is there anyone who can fire the pastor? This is a difference between denominations. Presbyterian churches, for instance, the session can fire the pastor, and the presbytery, more in the broader regional area, can bring up issues with a particular church that seems to be getting out of hand. There are consequences of that too, but that's a safeguard. For instance, if you have a flaming narcissist who is ascended to head pastor. So all of these are connected questions.
Yeah, there's no accountability. There's no higher authority that you can appeal to for safety. That very person abusing you is sometimes the final authority.
They are often where the buck stops. Yeah.
So with the recognition that things are really just beginning to be unearthed in this field, that the measurement of the prevalence of spiritual and religious abuse is still highly in question, and there's a lot of important research left to be done, I realize that with the continued dearth of research and therefore gaps in understanding about spiritual abuse, thinking at a practical and counseling level, not you yourself, you're in training to be a therapist, but how would you describe the broad responses that average people ought to be aware of when they are encountering or reading about spiritual abuse?
Well, it can be perpetrated by leadership, but also by the group itself. So that's maybe the first thing to recognize. So whether you're a leader or just a congregant, or if you're not in a faith community, but you might one day be in one, or if you have a friend group, the further you get from organized religion, the less spiritual authority there tends to be. And so if your quote church is in non-COVID times, the dinner party once a week with your 5 closest friend couples or whatever, you're probably not exercising a whole lot of spiritual authority over each other, I would guess. So for that person, not so much. It may just be more about looking at your own past. And again, finding language to process with your friends or with a therapist or your loved ones. But if you are a leader or involved in a church community, a couple things you can keep an eye out for is like narcissism among leaders, a culture of conformity within the group. You can look at what kind of pressure is being put on people. Where's it coming from? Are we genuinely open for people to express their feelings, even when those feelings are challenging and negative and hard to hold? Or do we need to bypass those negative feelings as quickly as possible? And if so, why? What are we getting out of that? What are we avoiding when we avoid negative feelings? What are we avoiding when we avoid doubts and questions? Can there be a forum specifically designed for questions? Everything is open. No questions are off the table. And we're going to talk about this stuff. Similarly, can lament become a part of our regular corporate practice such that people implicitly pick up that it's okay to be sad? Some of the numbers around inability to express unhappiness, to me, that's some of the most concerning stuff. The church, I believe, is a place where we ought to be able to express unhappiness. It's all over the Bible. It's in the Psalms. Jesus does it a ton of times. What's going on if we can't express unhappiness? So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but those are a few ways I think about it.
Yeah. What about from the perspective of victims? And just what's the appropriate response that you're learning for standing in solidarity?
If you are figuring out that you are a victim of this, you may have been blamed. This is something that appears to be fairly common, really not just in church settings, but just in general in society. We do a lot of victim blaming, and actually victims are not to blame for abuse that they suffer. It's obviously true, but it does not end up being that way a lot of times.
So it needs to be spoken, yeah.
It needs to be spoken. And you might want to see a therapist, and you can find spirituality competent therapists. There are ways to do that. My favorite way is just on psychologytoday.com, which is the main sort of landing page for finding licensed therapists. They have a speciality of spirituality as one of the items you can click as you're searching. But let's say it's not a clinical situation. Mark Karras, who's a therapist who does work around people who have heavily deconstructed their faith, gone through faith change, he recommends what he calls an unholy huddle. Find at least 1 or 2 people that are completely non-judgmental that you can talk about any of this stuff with. And it's very hard to get through these faith change experiences without support like that. There is not a lot written so far about this stuff, but there are a handful of books. If you search Amazon, you can find some books and maybe check out ones that your particular community would find palatable.
Yeah. Dan, thanks so much for joining me to talk about this really sensitive topic. I'm so grateful that you are contributing to the effort to shine a brighter light on this issue that's gone on in the dark for so long. Thanks for what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that study.
Thanks, Evan.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Dan Koch, a podcast host and doctoral student in psychology. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. We produce a new episode every Saturday, and you can subscribe through any podcast app. We're grateful that you're listening to this podcast. We're passionate about making this work consistently accessible to people who are genuinely concerned about the viability of faith in a world racked with division, contested views about what it means to be human, and what it means to live life well. If you're in a position to support our show financially, please consider partnering with us. We rely on the generosity of individuals like you to make our work possible. And if you're not, please continue listening and engaging the content. Let us know what you're interested in. We're grateful that you're listening. But if you can give, if you're truly passionate about supporting podcasting that's all about pursuing really living lives that are worthy of our humanity, then consider a gift to the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit faith.yale.edu/give. It's our joy to bring these shows to you, and we'd invite you to bring that same joy in supporting this work. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with more next week.